Good evening, everybody. Roberta has asked me to lead the meeting until we elect our new chairman, so that she is not constrained by the office. Before the meeting, we have Bryce Ward here from the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the university, and he has prepared a presentation on how affordable it is yet to live in Missoula. So, welcome, Bryce Ward from the university.
All right. Good evening. It feels weird to say that. I usually am talking in the morning or something. But again, I'm going to talk about Missoula's economy today. I've given a version of this talk several times in the past few months. And I've taken to calling it Missoula's economy, what's going on and how can we do better. Now, usually an economist like me, I get a little squishy or a little nervous about the second part of that, is the how can we do better. But I've taken to putting it in there because, these are my kids over here. Statistically, only 1 out of 3 of them is likely to live in Montana when they get older. Right? So 1 out of 3 native-born Montanans who graduate from college live in Montana as adults. Right? That's not because Montana isn't a nice place to live. Right? And speaks to the lack of opportunity. Oh.
We're having a hard time hearing. That's a little microphone. You could
This one here?
Yeah, if you hear it around, that'd be really great.
Awesome. Okay. Only 1 out of 3 of them is likely to live here, and it's not because Montana's not a nice place to live. It's because the opportunities here aren't necessarily the best. There's a lot of things that go into that, and so I kind of want to unpackage them a little bit today with a particular focus on housing. Before I get into the big picture stuff, I thought I'd do a quick checklist of, this is my standard little checklist. If you go to like a doctor, they're going to check your temperature and your blood pressure, all that kind of stuff. This is my version of that for regional economies. Just a handful of questions. Are people on net moving in? Are people employed? Is the economy growing? Are incomes rising? And are housing prices affordable? So the first question, yes, people are moving to Missoula, and that's the best sign. It's the most important thing, right? If people are moving here, then something is going well, right? That's the basic logic for this. Is look, if people are on net moving here, something has to be going right. And since 2010, almost 4,200 more people moved to Missoula than moved away. It puts Missoula in the 86th percentile of all counties. That's pretty good. Are people employed? The standard way that economists like to look at this is we say, look, let's look at prime age people. People are kind of 25 to 64. What share of them have a job? And in Missoula, it's 79.1%. That's pretty high. That puts us in the 92nd first percentile of all metro and micro areas. So that's good. Is Missoula's economy growing? Yes, it's growing, but it's growing at a rate that's slower than the rest of the country and slower than other small metro areas, right? So if you just look at the one on the right, that's just putting our output as a share of the average small metro and as the other metros across the U.S. And we kind of went from we kind of slowly trickling down, but not by a huge amount. If you look at employment, we're doing a little better on that one. We're growing a little bit faster than the U.S., but not nearly as fast as Bozeman. Skip that one. The basic checklist is, people are moving in, people are employed. Is the economy growing? It's kind of a mixed bag. Employment's growing, but output and income are sort of. And I left the housing affordability as a question mark because that's what we're going to do most of today. All right, so again, the fundamental question, but to go back to a second, the fundamental question when we evaluate Missoula's economy or any region's economy is, do people want to live here, right? Because if people want to live here, like I said, something is going right. If people are moving away, then something's going wrong. The problem, of course, is, what makes people want to live in a place? Well, people are usually drawn to places that offer good jobs, places that offer an affordable cost of living, and places that offer an amazing quality of life. So every place sets out to say, yes, we want to offer all three of those things, but there's a catch, which is that no place can in fact offer all three. Because if you did, if you succeeded in offering great jobs, an affordable cost of living, and an amazing quality of life, everybody would move there. And of course, once everybody moves there, what happens? Well, wages go down, cost of living goes up, and quality of life falls. Right? So while every place wants to offer all three, the reality is that you at best get to pick two. And so the question is, well, what do you want to pick? What mix of these things do you want to have? And then, of course, what mix can you actually have given whatever constraints that you might have, right? So where does Missoula fit in this little, the housing trilemma, or the wonky term for it is spatial equilibrium? Well, the good thing is, of course, people are moving here. The easy thing, of course, is quality of life. Simple basic stat for Montana, which applies, of course, to Missoula as well, is that, if you ask people, if you had the opportunity to move someplace else, only 13% of Montanans say they'd like to move to another state. It's the lowest percentage in the country, right? So much better than, say, Connecticut or New Jersey, where almost half of people are like, yeah, we'd like to move someplace else, right? So, if you flip it around and ask, is your state the best state to live? 77% of Montanans say that Montana is the best. That's the highest percentage in the country. So, people like Montana. What is it they like? Well, it's quality of life is the main thing that people tend to be drawn to. We can measure this in a lot of ways. We can also just go outside and look around. But we actually have measurements that say that Missoula actually, according to this one statistical wonky measure of quality of life, has the 10th highest quality of life amongst all metro areas. What is it that makes us gives us our quality of life? Well, the average Montanan spends more time outside recreating than the resident of any other state. Right? So this is a combination of two things. What's the odds that you go outside and recreate on a given day? About 30% of days Montanans are outside recreating. And when we go outside, we spend longer times than anybody else. And so when you combine it all together, the average Montanan spends about 45 minutes a day engaged in outdoor recreation. That's way higher than any other state, actually. How do we have the time to spend time outside recreating? Well, we don't drive to work very far, right? So, compare Missoula to a big city like Seattle or Portland or Denver, and you save about 20 minutes a day in your commute, just on average, right? We have other good things about here. We live longer, our schools are good, so basically quality of life, that's the easy part for Missoula's economy, right? So we're in that lower bubble. We have the quality of life bubble. The question is well, what's our other problem? Well, you all know what the problem is. The problem is wages, right? So here's median earnings for people over 25 by educational attainment. And you can see as you move up the education spectrum, the gap between the red bars, which are Missoula, and the gray bars, which is the US, get larger and larger, right? So if you look at that BA thing, you're basically earning about 60%, a little more than 60% of the US median if you have a bachelor's degree. It's almost last in the country. So, Missoula is not a great place in terms of the jobs and income, right? But the question is well, how much is that, these low wages are offset by a cheap cost of living, right? Because you can accept low wages as long as, the mix of quality of life and cost of living are balanced. And, right, so when we think about whether or not something is affordable, there's kind of three questions that kind of lurk inside of there. So one is, well, okay, how cheap is housing, because that's usually what drives the cost of living across places, relative to other places? How cheap is it relative to your income? And then how cheap is it actually relative to what it costs to produce, right? These three things kind of help us understand affordability. So if you just compare Missoula in absolute terms to other places, and you look at this thing called the regional price parity, which is something the government puts together as an attempt to measure the cost of living across place. Missoula is actually cheaper than the US overall. We're about 4% below kind of the average Missoulian cost of living is 4% below the average Americans, right? But there's lots of places that are cheaper, and there's lots of places that are more expensive. We're in the light blue category, at the bottom of the light blue category, so almost in the yellow category. But you can see, like, okay, well, what are the other light blue ones? It's kind of Atlanta, it's Raleigh, you know, Bend, Medford. There's lots of places that are in that category. You know, much lower than these dark blue places like San Jose, Honolulu, are about 30% cheaper than they are. But you know, not the cheapest place either. We're about 20% more than the cheaper places. Okay, so if we just dig into the actual housing component of that, it's actually a really complicated mixed bag, right? So we have rent, that's one piece of housing, and we have purchasing. And we have different sizes that we can rent. And if you do that, well, if you just look at rent overall, Missoula is only 83%, so the median gross rent, so the median renter pays only 83% of the US median renter, so $818 versus $981. You know, that puts us slightly above the median metro micro area, but well below the median metro area amongst other places in the West, right? You can see as we add bedrooms in the rent, we kind of move up that distribution. But you know, so in general, it's cheaper to rent in Missoula than in most other, you know, in the US overall and in other parts of the West. But if you go down to the bottom line, you look at median home values, suddenly it reverses, right? The median home value in Missoula is actually 132% of the US median. And then we're in the 89th percentile amongst all metro areas, and you know, still above the median for other Western metros. Skip that. So you know, in absolute terms, you know, yeah, Missoula is sort of cheap, but sort of not. Right? Cheap if you want to rent, not if you want to buy. And that depends on if you're comparing to all other parts of the country or just the West. Right? And in the West, we're still pretty cheap, even the housing. So we move to the second question, right, which is, okay, well, how expensive is housing relative to income, right? Because, well, we know that incomes are low here, but, you know, is the gap in housing, you know, going to keep us in balance, right? So, again, if we look at renters, so, you know, housing wonks, you know, there's no absolute share of income that's the wrong share of income or where you're burdened, but we kind of have adopted this 30% rule. So if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you're either rent burdened or housing burdened. And so what I've done is I've taken the share of people who are renters, that's the left column, and we say, okay, well, 47% of Missoula's renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent, right? So that's high, right? Obviously, if nearly half of renters are rent burdened, but we're not unique. We're basically right in line with the US, right? So 46% of the US is rent burdened, right? And we're low relative to other Western states where 49% of renters are rent burdened, right? So in absolute terms, 46% is still, or 47% is still a high share of people who are rent burdened, but we're not unique in having a rent problem, right? But if you flip over, and I'm using what's called selected monthly ownership cost, right? Which is, and I'm using only people with mortgages, right? So this is the combination of your mortgage payment, your property taxes, your insurance, and your utilities, right? So we look at that as a share of Missoula's homeowners' income, right? Well, we have 30% of our homeowners are spending more than 30% of their income on these selected monthly ownership costs, right? Again, that's a little bit higher. That's only slightly higher than the US, which is 28%, and a little bit below the West, which is 33%. So that same basic pattern holds, right? We're kind of relatively cheap on the renter side, you know, but a little bit expensive on the homeowner side. Of course, this is where we are today, right? Those of you who've lived here for a long time know that this is actually pretty different. Housing prices have risen a lot. So here we're showing you the change in home prices from the mid-'80s to today, and it's all indexed to 1990. And since 1990, housing prices in Missoula, adjusted for inflation, have almost doubled, right? Basically, it's the same as Portland. A little bit less than Bozeman, more than Billings, Kalispell, and just to show you that it's possible to not have housing price appreciation, I put Las Vegas in there. Can anybody spot the housing bubble? Vegas is famous for basically, being this kind of thing that where prices just grow with inflation, right? They just grow with inflation. Other than the housing bubble, then they kind of now come back, and assuming we don't have another housing bubble, they'll probably just keep growing with inflation. Okay, so you take this housing price growth of this magnitude, This is where you end up with the interesting story from Missoula. So I just focus on the 1990, right? So this is all taking median home value, median gross rent, and median household income, all as a percent of the US, right? So in 1990, everything kind of lined up. Home values, 84% of the US level. Gross rents, 75% of the gross of the US level. Household income, 82% of the US level. As we move forward in time, something changes, right? Gross rent and income, they go up a little bit. We've grown, our rents have grown at a rate that's slightly faster than the US overall. And our household income has also grown at a rate slightly faster than the US overall. So now we're 83% and 86% on those respectively, but not huge changes. Home values, well, that's a little different, right? So this is kind of a bit perplexing, right? Which is, how can home values grow at such a rate that's faster than income or rent? Right? This is a mystery, even to me, I'm going to try and do my best to explain it, but I don't really know the answer. What I will tell you is that it's a Western high amenity place. So basically what I've done here is I've just taken the difference between the values and the rents for some selected areas, and if you're dark blue, that means that your home values grew at a rate that's much, much faster than your rents did. And you'll notice, well, there's that. You see the Rocky Mountains, you see the Cascades, you see coastal California, you see kind of other high amenity places in the West. I didn't make a map, but if I did the same thing, showing you the difference between home price appreciation and income growth, you would see the same basic counties shown in, right? So Missoula isn't unique in having this weird thing. It is something that is happening in the West, particularly likely in very high amenity places. But it doesn't mean it doesn't matter, right? So if you check, and this is for Montana overall, I don't have this data for Missoula specifically because I had to use raw microdata to do it, but like what I'm showing you here is how much more of the share of income Montanans are spending on housing relative to that low period in 1990, right? And if you go out this way, I'm basically showing you different levels of income, and then the difference is just showing you how much more of your income you're spending. So over there, kind of in the lower range, people are spending, so low income people in Montana are spending about 10% more of their income on housing relative to 1990, right? And that's, the US is the other line, so they've gone up by much more. That's, the decline in affordability. We've lost some of our affordability edge. But even out at the high income level, we're spending about 4% more of our income, which is compared to like less than 2% US. So we're spending more of our income on housing in Montana. And so, I guess one last way of thinking about this is, so if you just take, that ratio of the median home value to median household income, back in 1990, it was 2.83. Today, it's over 5. That ratio is basically the same as Seattle. We're the 98th percentile, I think we're actually the 98th now. We've moved up in the past year. So, this is when we talk about affordability. This is usually the thing that scares us, right? Is that home values relative to income have kind of gotten all out of whack. All right, so the question is well, why? Or better, what can we actually do about it, right? So I'm an economist, so if you ask me, well, why are prices where they are, I'm going to tell you something about supply and demand, right? I'm going to tell you, okay, well, there's, price growth means that people want to live here. We see that from both the net migration data, and we see it in the price growth data. So we have demand growth. The question really is how much is supply responding to meet it? And if we want to make it more affordable, well, we got a couple of options, right? So we can either make housing cheaper, right? So we can build more housing. Or we can make it so people don't want to live here, right? That will reduce demand for housing. Or we can, work on the income side, which is, we can either have a bunch of people leave, and that might drive up our wages because the remaining work still needs to be done. Or we can actually make us more productive and increase demand. So this is, given that affordability has both a housing price component and an income component, we have these, both of these options. Generally, we don't want to do the red boxes. The red boxes mean, hey, let's make Missoula not a place that people want to live, right? So, hey, if we, wreck our quality of life or, get rid of all of our jobs, we can make housing really cheap, right? Just go look at the Rust Belt, right? Housing is really affordable in the Rust Belt. Why? Because nobody wants to live there. No, I apologize to anybody from the Rust Belt. Okay, so, wrong direction. So if basically affordable housing is a problem when demand is strong relative to supply. And so, what happens when this occurs, right? Well, if I ask you to imagine a cheap house, right? My guess is you imagine an old house, because usually that's how it works. We build houses, they're relative, it's not super cheap to build a house, but houses depreciate, they get old, and then you kind of buy them because you have to do a bunch of work on them. And that's, if you go to Detroit, which is the black line here, I'm basically showing you the ratio of median value over, the age of the house, right? And if you go to Detroit, a house that was built in, say, the 40s is 23% the value of a new house. In Missoula, they're the same. In Missoula, old houses don't become cheap houses, right? I guess only in the 70s do we have anything that's really, they're 90%, right? The median value of a home built in the 70s is 90% of the value of a home built in the last 5 years. Even Seattle or Portland and San Jose don't have, have the flatness of Missoula in this one. Okay, so why? Clearly that tells us that demand is really strong, and that supply isn't really keeping up, or that there's something else going on, right? So let's focus on supply. So if we want to understand supply, the question is, are we good at building structures? Do we develop real estate efficiently? Do we take raw land and turn it into lots efficiently? And then, of course, there's just how much land is sitting out there available. All right, so this is, a first attempt just to say, well, how good are we at building already, right? And so it's a little bit confusing, so stick with me for a second. So on the horizontal axis, I'm showing you how much we've built over 15 years, right? So it's the percent change in the number of housing units. And then on the vertical, I'm showing you how much prices went up. And the black line that's kind of angled up there, that's average, right? That just basically shows you the average relationship between building and prices, right? And you can see Missoula's pretty much on the line, which basically means that we're about average in terms of how good we are at building, right? And if you think about, if you move back this way, where it's harder to build, that's kind of, so you look at Los Angeles, right? So in Los Angeles, housing prices have gone up by a lot, and they haven't built very much housing. Right? That's the standard story, which is, okay, well, you don't build any housing and people want to live there, prices will go up, right? And down here at the bottom, if you look at like Las Vegas, I already showed you that their housing prices tend to stay pretty flat. People want to move to Las Vegas, they just go out in the desert and they build more houses, right? And so they've built a ton of houses, right? And so, Missoula, we're not terrible at building houses. We're pretty average, right on line with a bunch of other places in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Seattle, Eugene. They're all right on the line. So we're average, right? Of course, there are other places in Montana. Bozeman is well above average. It's, somehow manages to build a lot more than Missoula does. Kalispell has built more than Missoula has. So, it's possible there that, it's possible that we could maybe build more and maybe move ourselves down, and thus arrest some of this housing price appreciation. That's the theory, at least. So the question is, well, why don't we build more? Right? One hypothesis is, well, it's just actually really expensive to build here. No, it doesn't really work. We don't have, I took this data which Missoula wasn't in, but Billings is in there, and Missoula doesn't look that different in Billings. We're actually below average in terms of, what it costs to build a house. So, we can't blame that. Well, maybe it's that, it's the development component, right? Maybe it's that, the rate at which we expand out, the rate at which we consume land is low. And it's sort of low. So let's focus on this right-hand one, which basically shows you the expansion of the developed residential area. You can see that, yeah, places that expand a lot tend to have cheap housing. And there's Vegas again, and then there's San Francisco way over there. But Missoula's kind of in the middle again, right? We've expanded some, maybe a little bit less than, kind of an average metro, but, we're not terrible. We're certainly not terrible. Another thing that comes up is regulation, right? So maybe it's all just regulatory, right? And we don't have the data that they use here. There's a thing called the Wharton Land Use Regulation Index for Missoula. So it's possible that Missoula has more regulations than other places, but again, given this pattern that we see in terms of how the housing price appreciation is common not just to Missoula, but all parts of this larger Northwest where regulatory environments are very different, I'm not going to say that regulations don't matter, but I'm becoming skeptical that they're the main source of the story. Well, maybe it's just land availability, right? So if you take, this is a standard exercise, if you take and you stick, a pole right here, and you draw a circle with a radius of 50 kilometers, right? You ask, well, how much of the land is actually easy to develop? Our circle is awfully bumpy, right? There's not a whole lot of developable land, given that it's really hard to build on really steep mountains and underwater. In contrast, look at someplace like Dallas, where almost all of the land within 50 kilometers is developable, and thus it's developed, right? So, the standard story is that, oh, well, maybe we don't have, it's just too hard to build here because there's not enough land. But of course, we're still pretty small. There's still lots of land out there, right? Okay, so maybe we can figure out how to build more housing, and try and deal with it on that level. But it's also worth understanding, well, where is the demand coming from? And what's going on with demand? What's likely to happen with demand? And how have we managed to increase housing values without increasing income? Where is this demand coming from? Right, so if we think about demand for housing, housing is demand for place, which is then derived typically from quality of life and local economic opportunities, right? But we have two types of potential consumers, right? So on the one hand, we have people who are essentially footloose. They can live wherever they want, right? Their income is not tied to place. Right, these are people who are, just capitalists. They're independently wealthy. They're retired. They're telecommuters. They're people who can pretty much live wherever they want. Their income isn't tied to the local place. And then, of course, you have people who need to earn money locally. Right, so, how much of the demand for housing in Missoula is from this first group, right? This group of people who can kind of live anywhere. We don't have perfect data on this, but one way of attempting to proxy for it is I went to the IRS and I said, or IRS data, and said, okay, well, let's look at all of the income that's reported to the IRS by county, and then ask, well, how much of that comes from non-wage sources, right? So non-wage income. 42% of all income reported to the IRS in Missoula County comes from non-wage sources. Puts us in the 91st percentile of all counties, right? We're also in the 90th percentile in terms of the share that come from that very high, interest, dividends, and capital gains. Right? So our capitalist income. It's only 11%, but it still puts us in the 90th percentile. And then over here, I'm showing you the blue line, that's Missoula. That's the growth in capital income as a share of personal income over time. Right? So certainly part of the demand story in Missoula is that, again, in absolute terms, Missoula is cheap. Right? It offers a really nice quality of life. So if I have income that allows me to live wherever I want, it's a nice place to plop down. Right? So that's part of our demand. It's part of our demand story. Another part of our demand story that's kind of similar is second homes. Right? So, obviously, so here's second homes by state. Montana has almost double or more than double the share of second homes than the US, and the rate at which it grew between 2000 and 2010 was double the rate at which it grew the US. Right? So our share of second homes in Montana is growing. Missoula actually isn't super high in terms of the share of second homes. It's much a bigger deal, like in the Flathead, where 15% of all homes are second homes, which is in the 86th percentile. But it certainly can matter, and this is a really imprecise thing because people who split their time, where is their first home and where is their second home, they get to decide, and so the census doesn't measure it perfectly. The other source of demand are, we have telecommuters. We don't have great data on how many people in Missoula are, working a job that's elsewhere. Anecdotally, I can tell you it's large. When I first moved here 4 years ago, almost all of our couple friends that we made at the beginning, at least one person didn't work in Missoula than they were working in Seattle or Portland or England, Washington, D.C. So the question is, well, how do we like these people, right? Do we like this demand from these footloose people? And it kind of depends on where you sit in the economy, right? If you're in the local non-traded sector, right? So you're a hospital or a school or a restaurant or a store, who cares? Great, more people, more money, more business for me. That's all good. If you're the traded sector, though, it's a little more complicated, right? Because all these people are doing is bidding up the price of housing, making it harder for you to continue to make your products can compete in the markets that you're competing in, because you're now having to pay higher wages to compensate for the higher housing prices. There may be some offsetting benefits, but that's the basic story. But it gets a little more complicated, right? Because I posited that this is the simple way to do this. There's just we can make housing cheaper. If we increase supply, prices go down, things get cheaper. But put this graph back up again and just look at Bozeman. Bozeman has built twice as much housing as Missoula since 2000, right? Or the rate at which it's grown is twice as high. It's built almost as much housing as Las Vegas, and yet its prices have gone up by more, right? Which begs the question, in certain times, in certain places, and Bozeman may be one of them, and given how similar the fundamentals in Bozeman and Missoula are, Missoula may also be in the same basic category, which is Bozeman may be like a highway, right? And the standard story that urban economists tell about highways is you can't build your way out of congestion, right? If you add more lanes to a highway, what happens? More cars magically show up on it, right? And it may be in certain times, in certain places, that happens with housing as well, right? So all Bozeman did by building more houses than Missoula was it enticed more people to want to move to Bozeman, right? And there's a reason for that. How does this happen? Well, it happens for two reasons. One is when you put more people into a town, there's two good things that happen. The first good thing that happens is that consumer amenities get better, right? When there's more people, you can support more restaurants, more diversity of restaurants, better cultural events, yada, 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 go down the whole line, right? So, it may be that in a place like Bozeman that was really small and didn't have much in terms of consumer amenities, if you went back 25, 30 years, they suddenly have been getting them at a really rapid rate, right? So, hey, it's an even better place to live because people started moving there. The other thing that happens as you add people is that people get more productive, right? There's a reason why wages are higher in big cities than in small cities. It's because we think that when you put a bunch of people together, they all get more productive. And certainly that's possible. That might be the Austin, which is kind of lurking there underneath Bozeman's story as well, right? So, that's basically my little way of saying, well, the standard story for how do you fix affordability from the housing side is to build a lot of houses. Build more houses, houses get cheaper. But when I made this graph, and I put Bozeman on there, I started to go, maybe that's not the case, right? And so I'm still working on this. So this is just a hypothesis. This is a theory. But it's certainly Bend and Bozeman and Austin, raise questions that are hard to answer because they have built a whole lot of housing and they're still more expensive than, they're rising at places like, at rates that are faster than San Francisco. So the other part of how we do better is, of course, income, right? And, income is, of course, the real source of our problems. Incomes are low. So the question is, well, how do we raise income? And the challenge there is, well, essentially, how do we become more productive? And in particular, how do we become more productive in what we produce and sell to people who live elsewhere? So here I'm just showing you that size matters. So this is done, from a paper. And basically, I've got population on the horizontal, and and a measure of traded sector productivity. Again, the traded sector is the stuff that you sell to people outside. And you can see Missoula down there, way at the right or the left. This is essentially by saying, well, how do you get more productive? Well, you get bigger, but it takes a long time. So this one isn't a great one. So we're going to have to overcome the fact that we're small and will likely continue to be small for a very long time. The other problem that we have in Missoula is this one. This is a scary graph to me. This is from a paper that attempted to map economic regions, right? And they were measuring, commuter flows and, other economic flows. And this is the map. They came out and they put a label. Every time they kind of said, okay, that's a region, that's an economic area, they put a little label in it. And then there's this big empty spot, which includes the entire state of Montana. So the other problem that we have from how do we raise our productivity is, we're small and we're isolated, right? We don't have, we're not sitting here that's strongly within the orbit of, a bunch of giant metro areas. We have some that we can kind of touch, but, we're really kind of far away. And as a result, that makes things more difficult, right? So essentially, we on the income side, we have to figure out a way around these challenges of small and isolated. And I won't get, I can wander on to that, but I'm going to stop because I wanted to leave 20 minutes so we can kind of download some of this and discuss it. So, but that's the basic story, which is, Missoula's kind of, in the short run, it's kind of doing okay, but housing price growth is kind of a bit of a problem for us. And it's not real easy how we solve it. How we can either slow down the price of housing or increase incomes by amount that kind of helps us catch up. So we have some real issues, but those are our problems. And the question is what, if anything, can we do about it? So I'll stop there and we can, talk about whatever you want to talk about. Over here.
What definition of affordable housing do you use?
So I use the 30, so when we talked about again, there's three types. When we talk about affordable housing, economists will say, well, is it cheap relative to other places? So we talked about that. We talked, is it cheap relative to income? And there it was 30%, and using, the 30% standard.
You use gross income, right, on 30%?
Yeah. So household income.
Gross.
Gross household income and total income. And then, rent or value. And I didn't actually talk about this one. I kind of skipped these slides. But housing economists, we actually care about what it costs relative to what it costs to produce. Right? Because that tells me, so you take a look at how much housing, what is the price of housing relative to the price of producing housing. Right? Because if it costs a whole lot more to buy a house than it costs to produce a house, it tells me that there's something wrong in the market. Right? And houses are really expensive relative to what it costs to produce them here. Some of the highest in the country. All that really says is that the land that sits underneath your house, just drive around a neighborhood in Missoula and you look at some house from the 70s and you look at the price of it and you go, what? How much would it cost to tear that down and rebuild it? It's not very much. So you then go, well, that means that the lot that's sitting underneath it is worth a whole lot of money, right? And well, what makes lots worth a whole lot of money? You would think, well, that means that land is really scarce. And I showed you that there is part of the reason to believe that land is scarce. We have all these mountains that kind of hem us in. But there's still land out there. You drive by lots of empty lots too. And so the question is why? What's going on? And I don't really know. The standard story is regulatory. It's just regulation.
Isn't it a great deal of the fact that we are willing to trade a lower income because we love to live in Missoula?
Yeah, so that is how we measure quality of life, right? That's how an economist measures quality of life. When I told you that Missoula ranks 10th, that's literally exactly how it was done. As we've run a bunch of math and we say, okay, well, here's a super adjusted wage and here's a super adjusted cost of living. And whatever the difference is between you and average that's the quality of life premium. That's what you're willing to pay to live here. So certainly that's part of it. You're never going to solve some of this problem. The question is why is it growing, right? The ratio of housing prices, particularly purchased housing prices, to income is growing, right? Which suggests one of two things, right? Well, actually, it suggests that quality of life is getting even better, and that's great. The danger of that is, from that traded sector perspective, if it becomes too high and people are like, well, I can't afford to operate here, and they start moving, right? That's why I started with the picture of my kids, right? The danger version for high quality of life places is that they become clubs. It's like, oh, hey, here's this really nice place to live. We'll have some people who don't need to live here, these kind of footloose people, and a bunch of low-wage service workers, right? That's the danger zone that you're kind of on the path towards. And so the question is can we do more to try and arrest some of that? And, again, it's a choice, right? You can choose to say, yeah, no, we don't want to deal with it. Let's just kind of go down the path, let the prices continue to rise, hollow out some of the job opportunities, and maybe not grow as much.
I think what we need to do is workers need to demand a higher wage. The city council needs to, when people move in, like the triangle project, they need to say, well, great, we're gonna help you out by building this along with you, and in return, you have to pay a $15 minimum wage, or, I think workers just need to take a stand.
If only we had the power to do that. That's the challenge, right? Is all workers want more money. The question is how do you actually implement it, right? And doing so by fiat or by regulation, it induces trade-offs, right? It's not like we just say, oh yeah, we're just going to say we want more money and there's no consequences, right? There's trade-offs that come when you try and do that, and the question is well, what are those trade-offs, and are we okay with it?
People died asking for the minimum wage. They got killed for actually asking people to pay them the minimum wage. So there are trade-offs, for sure.
Yeah, no, but even economically, right? What we're seeing in Seattle is mixed, right? We don't have perfect data, but Seattle is leading the forefront, and the best study that's come out about it suggests that raising the minimum wage hasn't been good for minimum wage workers in Seattle. So it's a challenge, right? So great. We've raised the minimum wage, and if you continue to work and you earn that minimum wage, your income goes up, but your hours go down. And some of them, they just substitute out low-wage workers for middle-wage workers. At least that's what we're seeing in Seattle. Hopefully, other studies like that one, which is kind of using really cool data and really cool methods, will be done in other cities that are doing it. So we'll learn more about whether or not what those trade-offs are, and we can try and figure out what they are for us.
Do you have examples of communities where there's been a conscious effort to increase good-paying jobs or make housing affordable? What have other communities done to in these circumstances?
Yeah, so that's the challenge, right? We tend to try and look across the country, right? And the problem is that there's no other Missoula, right? And so you can sit there and say, and this is what the standard housing economist line is, we sit there and we say, well, houses are expensive here. You should be like Las Vegas. Why aren't you building more houses, right? And, and I've given that line and given that talk. In fact, I wrote one of the key papers that says that was, be like them, right? But, I wrote that when I was in Boston, and I was writing about Boston and thinking about big cities. And, if I look at the Pacific Northwest and I look at Montana, there isn't an example, right? You can point to places in the far south, and you say, okay, well, they built a whole lot, and their housing prices are cheaper, right? But you can't point to something that's kind of gone through, that looks like us, right? Maybe faces some of the same constraints as us. And that's where I kind of got with Bozeman. It's like, look, yes, Bozeman and Missoula are different as of right now. But if you just kind of look at them kind of objectively from a, just say, look, let's just value the amenities, so climate and, access to stuff, right? How close are the mountains? How nice are the mountains? What kind of recreation amenities do they have? What are their natural resources? The potential of Missoula and Bozeman strike me as relatively similar, right? If you could measure that thing, right? And we have an experiment. Bozeman built a whole lot more. They made, it is a little easier to build there just because there is a little bit of a topographic advantage. They have a little bit more flat, open space. But it didn't bring their prices down. In fact, they went up by more.
Look at all the capitalist income in Bozeman.
It's also high there. But, we're not that much different than they are, right? In terms of our share that's kind of coming from these other places. So it's not clear to me that we have a good solution, right? In terms of, it's part of what started me down this path was like, okay, well, there's got to be some example. We should be able to go to communities and say, oh, you want this outcome? well, here's who you would follow, here's the playbook. And what's becoming clear to me is that there really isn't a playbook. A, in part because every place is unique, but B, because within our part of the world, it just seems like housing prices go up pretty fast.
I just wanted to ask real quick, it hasn't really been touched on, but what, if any, role does greed play in this whole equation on the part of the developers and the slumlords? And one thing I wanted to point out as a student at the University of Montana, we got a quarter of our student housing units sitting empty right now. I think it's at 69% occupancy, yet we see, I've been priced out of student housing, and we've seen rent increases on the student housing units go up exponentially, which if we're playing by the capitalist playbook, violates the law of supply and demand. It makes no sense to me. So if you can address either of those two questions, the greed and the supply and demand, it doesn't seem to comport, at least at the university housing level.
Well, I mean, look, people want to make money. People who invest want to make money. People who work want to make money. That's normal. In terms of how prices go up when there's large vacancy rates, that is a good question. In some sense, they're just testing you whether you'll go someplace else, right? They're basically testing the limits of substitution. And basically they're saying, well, either we're still cheaper than the other alternative, or once you account for transportation costs and other things, we're cheaper than the alternative. And so, just because it's vacant doesn't mean, they're essentially exercising market power, right? You can think of them as a quasi-monopolist, basically saying, that's right. Yeah, no, and I'm not saying this is the right thing to do. I'm just saying that, from a pure market perspective, there is an explanation for it. In terms of if they're just trying to maximize their revenue or their profit or whatever you want to call it, they can leave some vacant and raise prices as long as they raise them by enough that it doesn't, they make more money from renting fewer units.
The question on the footloose data, is there any data that's broken out that throws out the interest and dividend people and retirees and just concentrates on W-2 wage earners that work for out-of-state companies that live here?
I've tried to figure that out. Because like I said, I moved here and all of a sudden, everybody know, there's somebody who doesn't work here. I'm like, this must be a thing. There must be good data on it. And the reality is so the census asks a question about where did you work last week, right? But the question is if I'm working for a company in Seattle, but last week I was here, I just say that I worked here, right? And then there's another data set which actually tries to place you, says, look, this is where you filed your taxes from, and this is where your employer said, what your employer was. The problem is it's really not very granular, and there's other issues like, sometimes the people who work here are technically independent contractors or small business owners, and the reality is that we don't show up very big in either of those things. So my anecdote just, maybe that we just don't have very many, at least relative to other places. But I can't tell you how big it is because the data are really murky. But it feels like it's big, but I don't know.
Missoula was at the near the bottom for productivity.
Yeah.
And wages and productivity are directly.
Directly, yeah.
Is that, it's not because we're slow or, is it basically?
Could be, I don't know.
Or transportation or a combination of the two?
So it's a couple things, right? So it's what's the value of what you produce, right? So do we have a bunch of really high value, high wage industries in Missoula? We don't, right? I came from Portland, right? And you can't look at productivity stats in Portland either, simply because Intel literally messes them up. You actually can't look at productivity stats in Oregon overall because of Intel. Intel by itself moves the data, right? They open up a new plant and suddenly productivity in Oregon is just massively higher. right? Well, it's just because the value of what they produce is really high and it doesn't take a whole lot of workers to do it. So, we don't have great data on this. Why are we less productive? The mechanical answer is that revenues per worker are low, right? That's true across Montana, but revenues per worker are really low. And so you go, okay, well, why is that? Well, it's either we don't produce a whole lot per worker, or what we produce just isn't priced very high. And it could be either one of those things. Certainly anecdotally, we talk about a quality of life penalty to productivity. Right? You have people who are like, I could produce more, but I'd rather, spend my summers like biking around, right? So there may be a little of that, but a lot of it has to do with just that we don't have, some super high wage industry that's just paying tons. We just kind of have a lot of average or below average.
So can you talk about the disconnect between the purchase housing prices versus rental housing prices? Is it because we have a lot of supply of the rental housing that's better, or what's better?
So I looked at that. There's a little bit of, if you just look at growth rates in rental housing versus owner-occupied housing, it's gone up by a little bit faster, but not by enough to explain whatever it is. To me, it suggests, and given the pattern that it's, this kind of region-wide phenomenon, they're just different markets. Somehow they're not working together. And in fact, it's weird because the Southeast is literally the reverse, right? If you go to Georgia and Florida, rent is really high relative to home value, right? And it's grown by a whole lot more than home values. I don't have a good explanation for it. Part of it may be this, footloose income deal, but part of it may be that it's, it's new development. Maybe there's this that, that we're kind of pioneering space versus, if you go to other parts of the country outside of this zone that we're talking about, there's houses everywhere. And there's infrastructure everywhere, right? Just imagine you fly over someplace, right? You look down in the west and you just see empty space, right? You get east of the Mississippi and you have the mile grid, right? You have roads, literally on a mile grid, right? Have you ever seen people who have mapped the US just with roads or with whatever it is? You can see the country, right? But you get out west and you see a lot of empty space. So so those are my hypotheses, is that, there's something more about the footloose income. There may be something about the fact that we just have, there's higher costs of development that we're not really factoring in terms of, pioneering new space. But
Density, is there increasing density of rental housing versus?
Maybe. I am doing research on it because I'm curious, but I don't have a good answer. I really don't. It's kind of a bizarre thing.
What is your opinion on inclusionary zoning?
Inclusionary zoning. Okay, so inclusionary zoning is essentially, where you try and you say to people, yeah, you can build more, but you have to build some other stuff as well to, either build more densely or build more low-income stuff in order to try and balance stuff. And, typically, I've kind of been like, well, look, just build, figure out how to build. But what I've been seeing here is it's actually suggesting that we have to do other things. If we want to have, assuming as a community, again, this is a political choice, assuming as a community, you want to be able to satisfy a whole range of incomes, right? You want to say, look, we want to have housing that's affordable for people that at this level, and this level, and this level, and this level, and this level. It's not clear that we can just build our way to a full range of housing, right? I used to think that. I used to think, well, just build more and you'll figure it out, right? But looking at the stuff where building more may induce more demand and it may drive up prices, suggests that we have to be willing to consider a range of alternatives, whether that's directly subsidizing housing, right? We just kind of say, look, we need to, we'll build the houses and we'll let them be market rate, but we're going to provide subsidies for houses, or we're going to subsidize construction in exchange for lower rates, or we're going to do some sort of zoning deal. I don't know what the right answer is. But I'm becoming far more sympathetic to the notion that if you want to have a full range of housing, we have to figure out how to actually provide housing at each level that we're trying to target, because it's not clear that the market will just take care of it.
Well, so on that note, how cities that have implemented inclusionary zoning, how has that affected their economy?
Again, this is where it gets. This is where this lack of comparison is. You can find places where, look, it's So I wrote a paper in Eastern Massachusetts. We gathered all the housing regulations across 185 communities around Boston, and we did not find really strong positive effects of any kind of inclusionary zoning. Right? It didn't seem to matter. It just seemed to matter how much regulation you had, right? But it's a different market, right? Where different things are happening, and so that's the challenge. Is how do we learn from other places and apply where things are clearly different, right? So another place, and this is just anecdote. I haven't done a study on this, right? Is I believe it was Flagstaff. I can't remember, but Flagstaff went through. They're like, okay, well, let's get rid of some regulations. Went through a whole big hullabaloo on trying to reduce regulations. Didn't solve their pricing problem. Didn't solve their building problem. And so, the challenge is that it's not a single zoning thing. There's not a single, we know that if people don't want to let you build, they'll figure out a way to block you from building. So laws can help them achieve those purposes, but it's also not clear that if you just build more, that it magically creates prices that are affordable to everybody. Bozeman is my key example of that. They have built more than Missoula. They are less affordable than we are, right? And so the question is why?
Going off of that, I know New York City does inclusionary zoning, and they do an 80-20 rule, and it's a really negative social impact. Like there's a lot of segregation in the buildings, like there's corridors, separate entrances, and people don't treat both the market rate and the low-income housing equally, both with the attention they get from superintendents and things like that. So there's a lot of social hardship to go with.
And there's other issues, which there's you can build these things, and the question is how long do they have to stay that way? And then sometimes they they'll be low income for so long, and then suddenly they can go up, and then somebody gets a windfall. There's lots of challenge. There's not an easy solution. Is the challenge, right? Is that I don't have a positive message of it's real simple. We can just solve this. This is just get rid of some regulations and it'll solve itself, or do this zoning trick. I don't know the answer.
I understood you to say that, based on the Bozeman example, that when you increase housing supply, it kind of induces demand.
It's possible that it induces demand.
Yeah, it seems like a really big assumption. Isn't the question whether you're increasing the supply of housing greater than you're increasing the demand?
That's right. That is the question, right? And and I don't think the Bozeman situation applies forever and in all places, right? But it's something you have to think about. Right? You have to ask yourself, all I'm really saying is that we need to do more research on this, because it may be that the simple solution that people like me say, which is just figure out how to build more houses, right? Want to lower the price of housing? Build more houses, right? That's the simple economist story. But places like Bozeman, Bend, Austin make me go, maybe that's not the case. Or maybe you have to get through some cycle where you build a ton, right? And you induce demand until eventually it catches up, and then you build more and it comes down. I don't know. But all I'm really saying is it may not be as simple as, if we just figure out how to build 3% more houses, things will get cheaper, right? It may be that, it could be that simple. It could be that simple. 3% is not going to cut it, right? If you just kind of look at that little graph, we have to build, if we kind of imagine lines going like this, right? And you imagine that, okay, that's the curve you're on. That's how much demand has, that's the exogenous shock to demand. Missoula would have had to build Bozeman level housing to keep housing prices where they were. Right? So if we had more than doubled the number of houses that we built over the past 15 years, then prices would have stayed where they were, adjusted for inflation in 2000. Right? So that's really the question, right? Is if we make that assumption, if we assume that supply doesn't induce demand, to reduce prices, to keep them where they were 15 years ago, we would have had to expand at double the rate, or more than probably double the rate that we did, right? So that's a lot more population. Maybe that's worth it. Maybe it's not. That's the political choice that you all, I guess, get to work on. I'm just like, you're trying to explain things to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We could go on that.